Man insults Cillian Murphy on a first-class flight. Instantly regrets when the truth is revealed. The first-class cabin of British Airways Flight 178 from London to Los Angeles crackled with an electricity that would forever change lives that crisp autumn morning. Among the passengers settling into their plush seats, Marcus Wellington III, a mid-level entertainment executive with massive ambitions and an ego to match, noticed something that made his perfectly manicured fingers tighten around his leather passport holder. There, in seat 2A, sat a figure that seemed to mock everything Marcus believed about success and status. A man in well-worn jeans and a comfortable black sweater that had seen better days, complete with reading glasses that looked like they came from a corner drugstore rather than a luxury boutique. The apparent intruder in this sanctum of luxury was completely absorbed in a thick stack of papers, oblivious to Marcus's growing indignation. This wasn't just about proper attire or social standing. For Marcus, it was about protecting the sanctity of a space he'd paid $17,000 to occupy. Every crease in the stranger's casual clothing felt like a personal affront to the exquisitely tailored Tom Ford suit Marcus had chosen specifically for this flight. This violation of unwritten first-class protocol demanded immediate action. Marcus wouldn't let this slide. He was, after all, somebody who mattered in Hollywood. Or at least, that's what he desperately needed everyone around him to believe. What happened next would become the stuff of Hollywood legend, a tale whispered in executive lounges and recounted in entertainment industry boardrooms for years to come. It would transform not just Marcus Wellington's life, but the lives of everyone who heard the story of the day ambition met humility at 35,000 feet. The meticulously controlled environment of British Airways' premier cabin was about to become the stage for an encounter that would strip away every pretense, every carefully constructed facade, and reveal the true meaning of class in all its definitions. And it would begin with 6 words that Marcus Wellington would spend the rest of his career wishing he could take back. As fate would have it, this was no ordinary flight, and that was no ordinary passenger. But before the truth would emerge, Marcus Wellington was about to learn the hardest lesson of his 15-year entertainment career. Sometimes the biggest stars shine most quietly, and true greatness rarely needs to announce itself. The cabin's soft lighting gleamed off the polished surfaces of the first-class suite as Marcus watched a flight attendant, Claire according to her name tag, approach with a tray of pre-departure champagne. Her practiced smile and elegant movement spoke of years of experience catering to the elite. But it was her trajectory toward the casually dressed man that finally broke Marcus's already tenuous restraint. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying that particular timbre of entitlement that comes from years of having doors open before you need to knock. "I believe there's been some sort of mistake. Economy class is further back." He punctuated his statement with a dismissive wave toward the rear of the aircraft, drawing the attention of nearby passengers who had been peacefully settling into their pre-flight routines. The man in the worn sweater slowly raised his head from what Marcus could now see was a screenplay. A pair of startlingly blue eyes met his gaze with an intensity that should have given him pause. But Marcus Wellington III had never been one to read warning signs when he was on a roll. Claire, the flight attendant, nearly stumbled mid-step, her professional composure cracking for just a moment before she caught herself. "Sir, she began, but Marcus was already building momentum. "Look at him," he continued, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that only comes from deep-seated insecurity masked as superiority. "He clearly doesn't belong here. I work in the entertainment industry. I'm very well connected, and I've never seen him before." Marcus straightened his Italian silk tie, a gesture that had become his unconscious tell when he was feeling particularly superior. Probably used miles to upgrade and doesn't know how to dress for first class. There are standards to maintain. The silence that fell over the cabin was absolute. Even the gentle hum of the aircraft's ventilation system seemed to hold its breath. The man in the sweater carefully removed his reading glasses, folding them with deliberate precision before setting them aside along with the screenplay. The cover page was now visible to anyone who cared to look. Small Things by Sarah Martinez. What happened next would be recounted countless times in Hollywood's most exclusive circles. though the man at the center of it all would never tell the story himself. That perhaps was the first clue to his true character, one that Marcus Wellington had catastrophically failed to recognize. Actually, came to reply in a soft Irish accent that somehow managed to fill the entire cabin without being raised above a conversational tone. I prefer to travel comfortably. But you're right about one thing. I don't belong here. The man paused, a gentle smile playing at his lips that would be familiar to millions of moviegoers worldwide, though Marcus had yet to make the connection. I usually fly private, but the studio insisted I take a commercial flight to reduce our carbon footprint while promoting Oppenheimer. The color drained from Marcus's face so rapidly that Claire instinctively took a step forward, worried he might faint. Sitting before him, dressed in clothes chosen for comfort rather than show, was Cillian Murphy, the actor who had just delivered what critics were calling the performance of the decade, the man whose portrayal of J. Robert Oppenheimer had already generated Oscar buzz that was less prediction and more certainty. Marcus's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. The realization of what he'd done, of who he'd just insulted, hit him with the force of a physical blow. His carefully constructed world of networking opportunities and industry connections seemed to crumble around him as he imagined how quickly this story would spread through Hollywood's gossip pipeline. But before he could stammer out what would undoubtedly have been an awkward attempt at damage control, an elderly woman seated across the aisle spoke up, her voice wavering with emotion. "Mr. Murphy," she said, leaning forward slightly, her eyes bright with recognition and something deeper. "I took my grandson to see Oppenheimer last month. He's studying physics at Imperial College London now, you know," he said, her voice caught for a moment before she continued. "He said your portrayal helped him understand that great power comes with even greater moral responsibility. He's determined to make sure his work always serves humanity's best interests." The genuine warmth that spread across Cillian Murphy's face transformed his features in a way that made Marcus suddenly understand why directors fought to cast him in their films. It wasn't just his extraordinary talent or those penetrating blue eyes. It was his ability to convey profound humanity in the smallest of expressions. Cillian turned back to Marcus, but there was no triumph in his gaze, no desire to revel in the other man's humiliation. Instead, his expression held something far more powerful: empathy. "You know," he said, his voice carrying that distinctive Irish lilt that had become familiar to millions. "I remember my first years in the industry. The pressure to prove yourself, to show you belong, it can be overwhelming." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because they were meant to hurt, but because they reached straight into the heart of his insecurity with surgical precision. How had this man, whom he'd just insulted, managed to see through his expensive suit and practice swagger to the frightened, ambitious young man beneath? Claire, who had been standing nearby with remarkable composure, chose this moment to add her own perspective. "Mr. Murphy has been flying with us for years," she said, her professional demeanor softening with genuine admiration. "He always asks about my daughter's dance recitals. Even remembered to ask how her Royal Ballet School audition went last month." A murmur of interest rippled through the cabin. A well-dressed woman in her 60s, seated in 3C, leaned forward. "The Royal Ballet? My late husband was a patron there for 20 years. She smiled warmly at Claire. "How did your daughter do, dear?" As Claire shared the story of her daughter's successful audition, Marcus watched in amazement as the first-class cabin transformed from a collection of isolated, important individuals into something resembling a community. And at the center of it all sat Cillian Murphy, who had somehow turned what could have been a mortifying confrontation into an opportunity for connection. The actor reached into his well-worn leather messenger bag, which Marcus now recognized as a beautifully aged piece from a small Irish craftsman rather than the mass-produced luxury brands he himself favored. From it, he extracted not one, but 2 copies of the screenplay he'd been reading. "I always carry extra copies," he explained, noticing Marcus's questioning look. "Sarah Martinez, the writer, she's a remarkable new voice. Been working on this script for 5 years while teaching high school chemistry in East London." He held out 1 copy to Marcus. "It's about a quantum physicist who discovers that the smallest acts of kindness can have universe-altering consequences." Sort of a butterfly effect meets string theory meets human connection. Would you like to read it? I genuinely value your entertainment industry perspective. Marcus accepted the screenplay with hands that trembled slightly, acutely aware that he was being offered something far more valuable than just pages of dialogue. This was a chance at redemption, a way forward through what he'd been certain would be career suicide. As the plane began its taxi to the runway, a flight attendant who looked to be in his early 20s approached with fresh glasses of champagne. "Mr. Murphy," he said, his voice carrying a slight tremor of nervousness, "I just wanted to say, my mother, she's battling cancer, and your performance in The Wind That Shakes the Barley, she watches it every time she goes in for treatment. Says it reminds her that the human spirit can endure anything." Cillian's response was immediate and genuine. He stood up, ignoring the fasten seatbelt sign that had just illuminated, and reached for his carry-on bag. After a moment of searching, he pulled out a small notebook and pen. "What's your mother's name?" he asked softly. "Margaret," the young man replied, his eyes wide. "Margaret Chun." Murphy wrote for several moments, his pen moving deliberately across the page. When he tore out the sheet and handed it over, the young man's eyes welled with tears as he read the personal message. "I'll make sure you get a photo from the new film's premiere," Cillian added. Something for her to look forward to after her next round of treatment. Marcus watched this interaction with growing amazement. Here was a man who had just portrayed one of the most complex and controversial figures in modern history, who had earned critical acclaim and awards buzz, yet he seemed most comfortable in these small moments of genuine human connection. The next several hours of the flight became an impromptu masterclass in both the entertainment industry and human dignity. As they discussed the screenplay, Cillian shared insights about acting, art, and the responsibility that came with storytelling. He spoke about his research for Oppenheimer, not focusing on the technical challenges of portraying such a complex historical figure, but rather on the moral weight of telling a story that still resonated with contemporary issues of scientific responsibility and human conscience. "You see," he explained to Marcus as they reached the middle of Sarah Martinez's script, "every story we tell in this industry has the potential to change someone's perspective, to open their eyes to new ways of seeing the world. That's why I choose my projects carefully. It's not about the size of the role or the budget. It's about the potential impact." The elderly woman who had spoken earlier about her grandson chimed in occasionally, offering her own perspectives as someone who had lived through the Cold War era. Her name was Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, it turned out, and she had been a nuclear physicist herself in the 1960s, one of the few women in the field at that time. "What fascinates me about your portrayal," she told Cillian, "is how you captured not just Oppenheimer's brilliant mind, but his humanity, his doubts, his fears, his hope that science could ultimately serve peace rather than destruction." As the hours passed, Marcus found himself taking notes in the margins of the screenplay. Not just about potential marketing angles or distribution strategies, but about the deeper themes of human connection and responsibility that seemed to echo both the film they were discussing and the unexpected situation he found himself in. A particularly touching moment came when Claire returned during her break to share photos of her daughter's ballet performance. Instead of just politely glancing at them, Cillian engaged in a detailed discussion about the choreography, revealing a surprising knowledge of dance that he attributed to his preparation for a role he'd never actually taken. "Sometimes," he explained, "the research you do for parts you don't end up playing becomes just as valuable as what you use on screen. It's all about understanding different perspectives, different ways of moving through the world." The conversation gradually drew in other passengers. A retired judge who shared his thoughts on the moral implications of scientific advancement, a young software engineer who spoke about ethical AI development, and even a quantum computing researcher who offered fascinating parallels between Martinez's screenplay and cutting-edge physics theories. What struck Marcus most was how Cillian managed to make each person feel heard and valued, never once pulling rank or attempting to dominate the conversation despite his celebrity status. He asked thoughtful questions, listened intently to the answers, and found ways to connect different perspectives into a larger narrative about human responsibility and connection. As they passed over the American Midwest, Marcus found himself sharing something he'd never told anyone in the industry: how his own father had been a failed actor who'd warned him never to pursue a creative career, leading him to choose the safer path of entertainment executive. Instead of dismissing this revelation, Cillian engaged with it deeply, talking about his own early doubts and the importance of finding one's authentic path. "You know," Cillian said, his blue eyes reflecting the afternoon sun streaming through the window, "sometimes the most powerful roles we play aren't on screen or in boardrooms. They're in how we treat the people around us, how we help others tell their stories." Dr. Blackwood, who had been quietly observing much of the conversation, suddenly spoke up. "That reminds me of something Oppenheimer himself once said after the Trinity test. Everyone quotes, 'I am become death, destroyer of worlds.' But he also said something else that I've always found more powerful. The open society, the unrestricted access to knowledge, the unplanned and uninhibited association of men for its furtherance. These are what may make a vast, complex, ever-growing, ever-changing, ever more specialized and expert technological world, nevertheless a world of human community." A thoughtful silence fell over the cabin as the passengers absorbed these words. Marcus looked down at the screenplay in his hands, then at his reflection in the darkened window. The man he saw there looked different somehow, less polished perhaps, but more real.